Of what Tufts University has to offer. A completely unique classroom experience that gives undergraduates the responsibility of adults by allowing them to run and organize their own conference. This year's EPIIC Symposium will focus on the world of tomorrow, order and chaos in the 21st century. Each panel will examine a different aspect of international trends that have the potential to create global instability. They will also be looking at the instruments and tools that could bring order to this system. For our opening panel, we'd like to welcome three distinguished individuals to discuss the implications of the economy of the future. In the year 1712, Thomas Newcomen built the first steam engine. A century later, steamboats were doing the impossible, traveling upstream. 73 years later, in 1785, Edmund Cartwright built the first commercially successful mechanical loom. Soon after, artisans began to see their work slip away, and the Industrial Revolution was upon us. But the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was much more than just a revolution of industry. It changed where people lived, how they lived, and what they did. People moved to cities in droves. Previously high-paying jobs were funneled into factories, and the natural resources of the world began to be used at a highly accelerated rate. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. In 1930, during the throes of the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes, one of the grandfathers of modern-day economics, stated that we are being afflicted with a new disease, of which some readers may not yet have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely, technological unemployment. For almost 80 years, we have been hearing more and more of that name, patiently waiting for Keynes' disease to get the best of us. Now, some believe that it may finally be here. In 2007, 77 years after Keynes' prediction, Steve Jobs revealed the first iPhone, a major step towards a computerized future. Now, a mere decade later, smartphones are ubiquitous. Smart homes are up and coming, and the world of the Jetsons seems right around the corner. Many people believe that we have reached the second industrial revolution, a rising machine age. They see the automation of most aspects of modern-day life as an unshakable future, the materialization of Keynes' prediction. But the question remains, is such a revolution truly upon us? And more importantly, if it is, how will it change the ways in which we live, work, and govern? The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was followed by mass unrest, as well as social and societal change. What might emerge from the automation revolution? And now, before I introduce each panelist, I want to explain how the evening will work. Each panelist has been asked to give 10 to 12 minutes of introductory remarks. We will then open the panel to discussion among the panelists, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. We'd now like to begin with David Dapis.
So what do I... Mark. Thank you. So, yeah. This one, huh? Okay, that's all right.
You should be able to control it.
Great. So I was asked to talk about the economy of the future, which was fortunate because my econometrics is not very good. And the future is much easier to do econometrically than the past, which has better data. This is not a secret. Economists are not very good at predictions. If you didn't notice it, we did not catch the global financial crisis very, very close to when it happened. And there's a reason for that. We have very good models that don't catch discontinuities. You know, if you have something that's been going along very steadily, it's great. But if something changes, we're not so good at that. And as a result, really important things are missed even in the short term. And I'm supposed to talk about the long term when things change even more. So, am I wasting your time? Possibly. But it is possible to identify some key variables and trends and policies and see what the status of those are. In other words, are the trends likely to continue more or less the same? Are they likely to reverse? Are they likely to accelerate? And the answer is it depends on the variable, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit as we go forward. One thing I looked at was a study of 2050 by PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers in the old days, a reputable consulting firm, if that's not a contradiction, and what they had to say was fairly sensible. Population has been shifting away from what we might call the rich countries for some time. It will continue. Birth rates will continue to decline. By 2050, only Africa and some of the Middle East will be more than reproducing themselves over time. For GDP that is internationally comparable, that's PPP for purchasing power parity for those who have had EC1. Right now, the 7 biggest rich countries, US, UK, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, and Japan, are about the same size as the biggest emerging economies, which are, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, Turkey, Mexico, and I think that's it. Anyway, so they're about equal now. In 2050, the emerging 7 will be about twice as large as the rich countries are now. So that is a big shift in economic gravity. That is going to be part of the future that will almost certainly be different. On the other hand, even though the poor countries are growing faster, global inequality may increase. The way I demonstrate this is that if you're growing at 2% per capita at $50,000, that's more than 5% per capita at $10,000. So for quite some time, you might have widening differences in income per capita, even though you have the lower countries catching up because they're growing faster. The other thing, which is, I think, very important, is the quality of life may not go in line with per capita income. You can see this in India and China, where pollution in cities is killing literally millions of people a year. You can see it in other ways with governance scores that we'll talk about in a little bit. But in general, many of the very well-educated people in emerging economies don't want to live there, including wealthy people. And that in itself is an interesting and possibly destabilizing factor. The other thing is that we're assuming trends more or less continuing. We're not assuming major wars, outbreaks of really destabilizing terrorism. We're assuming that public health problems with pandemics and so on are handled better than the Zika virus was last year, when it took 8 months to get a budget thing through. And things like migration and climate could also throw some problems at us that we're not quite ready for. The other thing I should mention vis-a-vis jobs, in the US now, 85 to 90% of all jobs are in services. It was 60% in 1950, it was 30 or 40% in 1900. So for quite some time, we've been going way down in agriculture. Hardly any agriculture jobs left now, 1 or 2%. We've gone way down in manufacturing. It used to be 25, 30%. Now it's 8%. Basically, we are a service economy in terms of jobs. Okay? So when you're talking about automation or robots, you think of factories and so on, which is fair. But that doesn't affect very many jobs because most of them have already been lost. And that's something that I think a lot of people, including perhaps the current administration, are not aware of. Okay, what drives faster GDP growth? I'm a development economist. This is my 2-minute summary of my semester. Higher initial income per capita means slower future growth. That's not a bad thing, but I mean, the closer you are to the frontier, the harder it is to innovate and so on, and so you don't go as fast as when you're catching up. Also, as you get richer, you tend to get more services, and services tend not, at least historically, to have the same productivity growth as manufacturing and agriculture, which are easier to automate in some sense. Higher investment as a fraction of income of GDP means faster growth, but only if you're investing sensibly. I mean, if you're, creating empty cities, if you're putting in excess capacity, if you're creating highly polluting activities which are going to have to be shut down, that doesn't work so well. Then you can invest a lot and not get very much faster growth, at least not growth that you would want. And that happens too. More education per worker has historically meant faster growth. We can talk about whether or not that will continue. The question there is what kind of education, and is it education that increases flexibility, or is it education that is very narrowly slots you in for something that may become obsolescent? And also, more debt to GDP means slower growth. If you borrow for investment that is sensible, you can pay off the debt, and the debt overall doesn't increase over time. If you borrow for wars or consumption or, the equivalent of, going to Mexico on vacation and putting it on a credit card, that will increase your debt ratio, and that means you have less to spend in the future. So that is another thing to consider. And in general, most of the rich countries have aging societies and fairly generous social contracts with the elderly, which means that that debt problem is getting worse over time. Now, governance is complicated, and I'm going to put in one of those graphs that you're not supposed to in a place like this because it's too complicated. The World Bank, with typical modesty, rates the entire world on its governance. It has 6 indicators, and they go from 1 to 100. So if you're absolutely perfect, like Norway almost is, you have nearly 600. If you're North Korea, you have like 10 out of 600 or something like that. Basically, what I've done here is take a bunch of countries by per capita income and show you their governance scores out of 600. Taiwan is almost 500. North Korea is very low. And in general, there's that dotted line is sort of the central tendency, of what is happening. And in general, there are a number of things. One bunch of countries like North Korea or maybe Pakistan or Bangladesh are Myanmar possibly, are in sometimes described as being in a low-income trap, where things are so poorly run in the country that they can't really get things organized and start growing sustainably. I mean, you can have spurts of growth from oil and so on, but it doesn't last. The more important one, perhaps, for our discussion is the Vietnam to Thailand one, where a country has grown for 20 or 30 years, but its institutions have not caught up. It's, like you're going from a local soccer league to a better one, and your coach is the same and doesn't really improve. In that case, the sort of crony capitalism, the poor governance becomes a barrier to catching up to the rich countries. And that happens quite a lot. Thailand now is growing about 3% a year, and it's a $15,000 or so, but it's not growing very fast, and it's going to take a long time to catch up. So governance is complicated, but it certainly matters. And if countries don't do well in governance, and I'm including the very rich ones, that is going to be problematic for the future. Okay, banana peels to a better future. Technology will eliminate many jobs. There's no doubt about it. Truck driver, I wouldn't take a course if I were you. I mean, I'm just saying. Even white-collar jobs. If you've read about neural networking and translation and Google and so on, you know that it's getting very, very good, scary good. And when these jobs are eliminated, there is a tendency, not inevitable, but a tendency to increase inequality because a lot of middle-class jobs evaporate. The other thing is that this technology often increases the productivity of capital, and 80 to 90% of net financial capital is held by the upper 10%. So, capital is grotesquely unequally owned, and the technology is increasing its productivity. How do elites respond? Well, they could respond in two ways. One I'll call basically Scandinavian, where the idea is, well, we're all in this together, and we better make sure that you have a basic income and retraining and stuff like that, and health care and whatnot. And people then feel a certain security and are willing to buy in to change, and you have a fairly stable, if not super dynamic situation. The other one is what I'll call the bare-knuckle neocon kind of approach, which is more, you're on your own, sink or swim, life is tough, suck it up, and there's a fair amount of that as well. But that tends to lead to less productive responses. People get angry, they vote for people perhaps they shouldn't, and in general there's more resistance to many things, including immigration. Immigration is complicated, but anyway, how am I doing on time? Am I already over? Okay. Give me another 3 minutes. This is Sherman time. Another point is that climate change itself could result in large flows of migrants. This is not just sea level rise. This is weather changing, displacing farmers. I won't get into it, but there's going to be a lot of push factor that is going to be problematic, I think. And then, on the other hand, you have, in part because of the concentration of wealth and so on, a poor receptiveness to migration among people that feel very insecure. And so one sort of bad outcome could be more terrorism, more authoritarianism, unproductive spending in aging societies which actually need migrants. So if the people were a little more secure, they would get the migrants they need and the society would work better and you wouldn't spend so much on walls and police and so on. But that isn't happening everywhere. So possible policy responses, I've already sort of suggested them. Subsidize lifetime learning and retraining, ensure minimum income and health care. Switzerland already is talking about that. Help workers move to where the jobs are. Often it's a spatial problem. Workers are in one place, their house isn't worth much because there's nothing going on. They can't sell because the mortgage is too much. If you give people help with that sort of thing, they're much more likely to be productive and secure. Make it easier to work with children when elderly. Part-time child care could be supported. And these policies that I'm suggesting are harder in ethnically diverse societies. If you're Denmark, it's easier. If you're the U.S., it's harder. But there's Canada. Canada is fairly ethnically diverse, and it manages to do many of these things much more than the United States does. I'm not saying that Canada is the right model. I'm just saying that it's not impossible in ethnically diverse societies to do sensible things. And finally, I think capital tends to be mobile. It's very, very difficult to tax capital because it can go to a lower, tax income country. And I think there's going to have to be in the next 10 or 20 years some agreement on minimum levels of global taxation. How that's sorted out is a nightmare diplomatically. But if any of you want to study international tax accounting, you probably have an annuity. So good luck, all of you. And I think the future, I have absolutely no idea what's actually going to happen. But whatever prediction I make will be completely unaccountable. So why don't I stop there?
So I'm sorry, I actually forgot to introduce Mr. Dapis. David Dapis is an emeritus professor of economics at Tufts University. He also holds a post as an economist at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University. He has worked extensively in Vietnam, Myanmar, and Indonesia, where he held a post as an economic advisor for 2 years. Dapis has also served as on the selection boards for Fulbright and Fulbright Clinton fellowships. So thank you again, Mr. Dapis. Next up, we have Manuel Muniz. Manuel Muniz is the director of the program on transatlantic relations at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He is a David Rockefeller Fellow of the Trilateral Commission and a holder of the Atlantic Council's Millennium Fellowship, and organizes high-level seminars at Harvard University and the University of Oxford. During the spring term of 2017, Muniz is teaching the EPIIC course at the Tufts Institute for Global Leadership as a professor of the practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Everyone give him a round of applause.
So I think I'll speak from here, but and I'll start with this. So I was in Munich last weekend for the Munich Security Conference, and there was this feeling in the room. Maybe later in the Q&A we can discuss some of the issues that came up there. But I had this feeling. How many of you have read The Magic Mountain from Thomas Mann? It's a very thick book, so a few heroes in the room. But it's a fascinating book. It was written in the turn of the century, the 20th century, and it's basically, the plot is you have these people in a spa in the Alps, and they're discussing the situation in Europe. And through the conversations, this feeling is emerging that there's something brewing. There's something broken in European society. The tensions are growing. You can sense the conflict that was about to engulf Europe, both in the First and the Second World Wars. And I have to confess that when I go to Europe and you speak to people and you go to some of these conferences, that's exactly the feeling you have. I mean, we're all in this spa and we're discussing these things, but there's a big fracture underneath, and we don't know where we're headed. We're sort of in the fog, but the sense of instability is there. And it doesn't matter if you're discussing the future of the EU, the future of NATO, the future of transatlantic relations, the situation in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, in the Middle East. Wherever you look at in the world, there's this sense of fracture. Now, there's a big puzzle here, and I'd like to start with the puzzle. On the one hand, we have an extremely prosperous world. So if you look at most of our indicators of prosperity, whether it's GDP figures about longevity and life expectancy, figures about literacy, the quality of democracies or the number of democracies. If you look at Freedom House data, we've never had so many democracies around the world. Most of them are doing very, very well. In terms of economics, I mean, for example, the U.S. has a GDP today which is about 10 times higher than it was in the 50s and 60s. That's sort of golden age that people keep on going back to, and that's in real terms, so you're 10 times more prosperous. The figures from Spain, where I'm from, are even more scandalous. Like in the 60s, we had about $300, $400 of GDP per capita. Today is close to 30,000. So we've never been more prosperous. That's on the one hand. On the other, there's this big convulsion that I'm speaking of. We've had Brexit, we've had the Trump victory, we have an incredible year in politics in Europe ahead of us with presidential elections in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the extreme right and the extreme left is going to do very well in some of these elections. There are big questions about France, and we can discuss France later on. And I just heard today Bannon speak at CPAC about economic nationalism in the U.S. and a change of the system. So this is the puzzle, right? The world is doing extremely well. Most of our countries have never been more prosperous, according to many of our measures. But on the other hand, we have this huge revolt against the elites and against the system. So what on earth is going on? What on earth is going on? And this is, it's a fair question. Now, a few diagnoses have been put out there and theses have been put out there about why we're in this mess. There's a whole thesis which is this has to do with new media, social media, the breakdown of public debate, the post-truth era, and there's a lot about that, and perhaps we can discuss it in the Q&A. There's also this issue about immigration and identity politics and the threat to the sort of the white male in the U.S. and this issue of nationalism and identity politics again in our societies. There's yet another diagnosis which has to do with values, education, the collapse of our values, and there's a questioning of sort of capitalism. Yes, we're more prosperous than ever, but there's something wrong sort of metaphysically with the design of our societies. There's more to life than being more prosperous. So even if we're more prosperous, people are still unhappy about how they live their lives. And then there's the fourth category, which is the economics are wrong. And the economic argument is broken down into two. One has to do with trade and globalization, and that's the Branko-Milanovic argument. There's been a lot of jobs and production that has been displaced to places like China and India, and that has affected our middle class. And there's also another economic argument, which is no, this is technology, and it has been addressed before. It's about automation, it's about the erosion of the middle class, and a few other things. My thesis is that actually the big driver is that. The big driver is technology. That's the one that is really structural, that is here to stay, and it's probably going to get much worse. So I'll delve into that. But we can discuss what the other factors, how they interplay, and how they relate to one another. I don't think this is a monocausal issue. I think there are many drivers, but I think the fundamental one, and the one we really do not yet understand, has to do with tech. Now, I think this issue is so significant that I think it is in essence a breach of our social contract, and I'll tell you why I think that's the case and why it is significant and important to look at it this way. I don't know how many of you have seen this data, but from the 1970s onwards, we've seen a decoupling of productivity and hourly wages. It's very marked. I haven't brought some of the slides that I used to show this, but essentially from the 1973 onwards to today, our productivity has grown by about 250%. During that same period, hourly wages have remained stagnant. So we have found a way to increase our productivity without creating jobs or paying more for the jobs that we currently have. This, although it seems somewhat technical and obscure, it's actually a huge development because it means that our normal path of development for about 150, 200 years, our development path was, or our assumption was, if you grow in productivity, that eventually trickles down to wages and it feeds into a middle class. That has not happened since the 1970s onwards. That is because of technology fundamentally and smart machines, AI, advanced robotics and others, and the convergence of a number of technological developments that allow for huge spikes in productivity without creating jobs. This is now affecting the tertiary sector and the services sector, which was also mentioned. We have seen processes of automation in the past, similar to this one. I mean, we've seen this happen in agriculture, as it was mentioned. From about 1860 to about 1960, agricultural employment in the U.S. collapsed from over 60% of the labor force to single digits. That has also happened to manufacturing. It's now starting to happen to services. Okay, so and that's what's producing that decoupling. That is leading to a huge stagnation of wealth in the middle of our income distribution. If you look at what has happened to income for families in the middle of the income distribution in the US and Europe in the last 20, 30 years is staggering. I mean, there's data from McKinsey and others on this, and in the last 15, 20 years, about over 90% of households in Italy saw the real income either stagnate or decline, over 70% of households in the US, over 80% of households in the UK and Spain. So it is that stagnation of income in the middle that I think is very much behind the upheaval and the political fracture that we're living. This is producing high levels of inequality because, of course, if you take a period of huge economic growth with stagnation in the middle, what are you getting? You're getting huge levels of inequality. There's a lot of income concentration in capital, people that are the owners of the robots, the owners of the algorithms, essentially the owners of the productivity within the economy. And again, we haven't seen levels of inequality like we have in the US or Europe in the last 80 to 100 years. In the UK, you have to go back to about the mid-19th century to see levels of inequality like the ones that we see today. This is producing really the death of the American dream, and if Trump is right about something, it's about this. And what we've seen, and this is some fascinating data, is we've seen that the probability of people born in your generation of making more than their parents, than your parents in your lifetime, has collapsed from about over 90% for people born in the 1940s to about 50% for people born in your generation. So that's a huge collapse in the probability of you guys progressing economically, fundamentally, compared to your parents, right? And there's some data on that produced by a researcher at Stanford called Rach. He was given access to a huge tax database, and he calculated this. So an American born in the 1940s was very likely to do very, very well, much, much better than his parents. You guys, not so much. And I'm sorry about that. There's a good 50% chance, so 50% of you. It's sort of like a coin toss. But this is a big issue, right? If you take this as a society, I think this is very hard to digest, and this is politically very explosive, and this is what is playing. I think it's very much affecting our politics. Now, I think what this is producing is a huge political convulsion, and it's actually producing the collapse of the liberal order. And this is what we're seeing. And that collapse is slowly taking place. And I think that this is playing out in three fundamental ways. One is in what can be called the anti-elite era. And you can see levels of trust in elites, economic, political, academic, etc., collapsing across the Western world. In the anti-liberal era and the attack on the institutions and the order that those elites have constructed, and that means a movement against free trade, cosmopolitanism, porous borders, etc., even international law, etc., right? And we see this in Europe and in the United States. But also, and I think this is the most consequential and greatest of all the ways in which this is playing out, is a rapid fall in the support for democracy as a system of government in our countries, including the United States and most Western countries. So I don't know how many of you are aware or know of this data, but the latest World Value surveys throw some incredible figures. About a third of Americans would support an authoritarian government in the United States. So they answer that what the U.S. needs is a strong leader that doesn't care about elections and parliament. So that's a third of Americans. Also, the Americans saying that it's essential to live in a democracy has collapsed in the last 40 to 60 years. So Americans born in the 1940s and 50s, about 70% of them would say it was essential to live in a democracy. People born in the 1980s, that's down to about 30%. So a huge collapse in how people consider, in whether people consider it essential or not to live in a democracy. This is true, by the way, across the board. It's true in the UK, New Zealand, in Spain, in Italy, across the Western world. So there's a question for us there of why that's happening. Now, for me, this is very similar to what we lived at the beginning of the 20th century. And we're back to Thomas Mann and the Magic Mountain and this idea of social fracture, right? At the time, we also had a huge shock to the economy, a change in the economic model, displacement of a lot of people economically. We had the emergence of a new economic class. At the time, it was the proletariat that ended up manifesting itself politically. I think in our time, that class is the precariat, and we can discuss how that looks, because it's not even the unemployed. It's the unemployed, but it's the subemployed, the underemployed, the people that are employed but are poor, the working poor. It is that whole category that is now emerging both economically and manifesting itself politically. The consequences are very similar to the ones that we lived in the beginning of the 20th century. Political radicalization, support for groups that want to break the system, aggression against minorities. It's a long list, but the similarities are staggering and very worrying, right? And the fracture, I think, could very well lead us to all sorts of things, but including conflict. And I'll just give you an example because I'm running out of time. But in July, I was in the Balkans first, and then I went to Warsaw for the NATO summit. But the visit to the Balkans was extremely interesting. So there are a whole range of arrangements in the south of Europe, in the periphery of the European Union, that are dependent on the strength of the EU. Right. So stability, for example, in Bosnia, there are political and economic arrangements that are there. That country is governable only because it has EU accession perspectives, because the EU is strong and they want to join the EU. Nothing works in Bosnia if it's not because of the pressure of EU institutions and others. Now, if we keep on weakening the core of the EU through Brexit, Frexit, or whatever ends up happening this year further, we're going to have shocks in the periphery. And I think violence and other issues are, shouldn't be taken off the table. I think that's a possibility. So we should be very concerned about how all of this plays out in the next few months and years. Now, regarding the solution, and I have 7 seconds left, so that's a challenge. But I'll tell you, if the cause is structural and it has to do with this issue of the change in how the economy works, in the contact of technology with the jobs market, with income generation and distribution, then we should be focusing on finding structural solutions to that. And that's much harder than what people are currently discussing or looking into. I think there will have to be changes in the way the state procures its income, because if labor income is not going to be so central, then we should probably find ways to tax capital or democratize capital. Then we should also rethink or think about ways of distributing that wealth from capital to a middle class that is different from salaries. Now that's a huge issue. How you do that is very complicated, perhaps through universal basic incomes, social programs, public employment schemes, all sorts of things that we should be considering and looking into. It also changes the role of the corporation and what corporations and the private sector should be doing, because that decoupling that I was telling you about means that the narrow objective of maximizing shareholder value is insufficient. It is simply insufficient, because you can maximize profits and production of goods and services in your company but not create employment. So if everybody does that, you end up being extremely profitable but operating in a political and social environment that is extremely hostile. And then you get these populists in power and they break trade agreements and they increase taxation and they expropriate companies, etc., etc. So the concept of sustainability in the private sector really needs to be expanded to include social issues of this sort, right? That's a huge question. It brings up collective action problems of all kinds. So I think what needs to happen is we need to have a very deep reflection about these things, and we need to think about solutions that entail a redrafting of our social contract. Unless we do that, we're going to have a deepening of the crisis that we're currently living. What we've lived so far have only been the beginning of this convulsion, and I wouldn't discard seeing developments like we saw in the 1930s and 40s, etc., etc. So it's very worrying. For the time being, we're all in the spa in the Alps, but after the spa, we had some serious trouble, particularly in Europe and in the US. Thank you.
So thank you, Manuel, for your uplifting speech. Finally, Dieter Ernst. Dieter Ernst is a senior fellow at the East-West Center and is a former senior advisor to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. Ernst also served as a scientific advisor to the World Bank, the National Bureau for Asian Research, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. His areas of expertise include China's industrial and innovation policies and Asia's emerging knowledge economies. Please welcome Dieter Ernst.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. So, in the midst of the scenario, or the situation rather, that Manuel described, we have a few additional complicating factors. You know, when Thomas Mann and also Stefan Zweig wrote their deeply disturbing, pictures of the fracture and the transformation of societies on the eve of the First World War, we were basically talking about Eurocentric developments. Today, we have many more actors, and it so happens we also have an actor which is called China. And we could, talk about other actors, but China is, given its sheer size and also its ambitions, matters. And so what I thought I'd do when I, was asked to talk about the future of the economy, and actually I realized we're probably nicely complementary. I thought what I do is I talk a little bit about what's actually happening on the ground in China. China is, by the way, like us, faced with a number of problems. I mean, they did have rapid-fire growth, by all means. Amazing. Compressed in a very short period of time. The figures are just mind-boggling, and I don't want to, you know them, I guess. It's just, it has been like this. But at the same time, they face and this was mentioned also in the first presentation, they face tremendous constraints on environment, human, financial resources. They have a problem of a declining workforce, rising wage costs and all of that. And they realize that they are now in a situation where the main external force which was facilitating their catching up, that is international trade and investment, there are headwinds now on the international economy, even before someone like Trump or Brexit entered the stage, or Brexit happened. Even before, we have a substantial decline in the growth of international trade. And why does that matter, at least from the perspective of China? Because that was the catalyst, the carrier, which enabled China to do what they actually achieved. That is this outrageously fast quantitative development of an infrastructure and of manufacturing capabilities and what have you. So that they have, but they realize that the environment they are going to work in over the next 10 years includes what you described, what you described, because these developments from their perspective affects their markets. So they realize they have to dramatically change their strategy away from this export-oriented factory of the world, low labor costs, what have you, top-down, government-centered. They are actually, if one would compare, the challenges that the US is facing, European countries is facing, and the challenge a country like China, or for that matter India, is facing, I'm not sure which country faces the larger challenges. Probably not important. It's all simply to say these guys, who are sometimes our partners, sometimes it seems they are our adversaries, these guys are facing challenges. They are concerned about how they can sustain their current development model, and they are searching desperately for ways, to upgrade. And I think this is something which we need to understand, first of all, because if we don't, then we we need to understand the perceptions on the side of the Chinese of what they think are their challenges, their strengths and their achievements and their weaknesses. We also need to understand, these very different forms of social experimentation, how they are trying to develop new policies. They are not following our patterns, which makes things, from our perspective so difficult. We normally simplify and say, okay, so this is state-centered mercantilism, techno-nationalism. Yes, it is. By the way, we did the same thing 100 years ago, or, in the US, in Germany, what have you. Yes, it is. But what else should they do? So, after these somewhat loose remarks, I want to get to the essence of what I want to convey. China is, given the way the system works, trying to push forward very ambitious and bold strategies of how to basically push forward advanced manufacturing and services. And they are, the leadership and also in particular the people who are supposed to implement these strategies, and these are people who have actually worked and studied overseas. These are the people who know how, if at all, to implement, the vision, the suggestions, the commands, or whatever you want to call it, they get from the top. These are the people who know what constraints they would face. Their policies, for instance, there are 3 policies, I think, which matter. And by the way, there should be some materials on display of the studies which, could provide you with details on the policies. So where are things happening and why does it matter for us, and what actually might be misperceptions? That's what I would like to talk a little bit about. One thing is a huge, massive push in the core component of any high-tech industry, that is in semiconductors. China has a policy now in place which, funding is, there are no limitations. And the objectives are basically, right now China has a huge disconnect. China is by far the most important market for semiconductors, and it's by far the most important market for US semiconductor firms. But Chinese production of semiconductors is roughly about 10%. They want to dramatically increase it, and the way they handle it, is our assessment at least, is that they should be able over the next 10 to 15 years to drastically narrow down the gap to the US in semiconductors. In addition, there's a second big program, which is called Manufacturing in China 2025. And this is interesting because that concept is basically originated out of close cooperation with a concept developed in Germany, Industry 4.0, Industry 4.0. Very close, actually, cooperation on a government level and also company-to-company level. However, and that's interesting, from our perspective, both the German and the Western perspective, China adds a new approach to these efforts because they have firms who are very strong in internet-enabled networking technologies, digitization. So they have what they call the BATS, B-A-T-S, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. These firms are actually, they have moved in a very short period of time towards the frontier. So we do research where we talk to the Chinese actors in industry and in government, but in this particular case also to the German actors. And the German actors would say in some areas they are actually ahead of us. They are ahead in the sense that because they start at a much lower level, they need to imply much more aggressively the capability of networking technologies, artificial intelligence, and what have you. And so I think the theme I would like to propose under this topic is China can also add a new variation to these technological, to these technological paradigms. Now, much of the debate we have in this country about these policies is unfortunately somewhat narrow and concentrated on the question, to what degree is that a threat to our existing, leadership in these technologies? And that's a real issue, but I think if we would only concentrate on this issue, we would lose out the much more important issue, that is, to what degree would that actually allow us to establish mutually beneficial forms of cooperation? Because after all, despite what I said so far, the technological leadership of the US compared to China in these particular industry remains huge. Both the US and China in these industries are interdependent, but there's unequal interdependence between those. That is, we, the US, need the Chinese markets. US semiconductor firms depend on 30 to 40% of their sales on the Chinese market. So that's the one part. But the other part is China needs us even more. And this right now is a situation where, in terms of they need our technology, they need our management capabilities, they need to engage in forms of cooperation, despite the fact that they try to selectively promote their domestic firms. They still need to engage in global knowledge sourcing. So they are facing a fundamental, trade-off. From our perspective, the question would become, can we intelligently use that unequal interdependence and can actually, not try to prevent the success of what the Chinese are doing, but rather, to basically engage in constructive cooperation. I think I'll leave it at that because probably if in the Q&A, please ask me questions. I may end up giving you many, kind of down to the earth, deeply microscopic insights, stories that may hopefully help to explain what the message that I'm trying to convey. But in the end, the even more fundamental message is, so the current administration tries to implement a policy of trade warfare against China. If you really carefully think through possible scenarios of how that would work out, unfortunately, the conclusion would be that China can retaliate and do a lot of damage to industries that are very central to us. Start with agriculture, go to Boeing, go to semiconductors, go to IT. The scope for retaliation of the Chinese government and the firms actually who would probably be motivated to participate in these retaliatory measures is huge. Now, our conversations with people at the ministries, and particularly in the Ministry of Commerce in China, which usually is the one which promotes openness and international cooperation, but they would say right now with what might happen in the US with the current administration, we have been asked to prepare all the tools that we need in order to retaliate. They are ready. And so they know, for instance, that in Midwestern states, the damage that could be done would be particularly severe. So what I was trying to do is, in the context of the disruption and the fractures that we're facing in our world, we have an additional, increasingly powerful actor, China, who is trying to sort out its own problems and trying to catch up fundamentally, and trying to build up structures, infrastructures, capabilities. And so this happens in an environment that is very much in turmoil and hostile. Can we find ways, to reduce this conflictual situation? And in order to do that, and that's my last sentence, in order to do that, we need to understand the perceptions on the other side, that is the Chinese, of what they think are their strengths, their weaknesses, and their main challenges right now. we cannot impose something on them. That, that may have been the situation at the end of the First World War. We could do that. We can't do that anymore. So we need to understand, and then we need to shape policies, economic policies, industrial policies, and of course also security and defense policies, taking that into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ernst. So now I have my own questions, but I think we'd actually like to make this a discussion and open it up to questions that you may have for each other just from listening to the initial findings and research of each other person on this panel. So whoever would like to start, feel free.
I'm going to ask Dieter about China. I work in Vietnam. Vietnam worries a lot about China, not in a good way.
Yes.
The questions they ask me is, should we participate in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? And I say yes, but without enthusiasm. And they say, why? And I say, because a lot of the projects don't work out very well for the countries. And I think China has a problem diplomatically with a lot of countries, and I'm struck, I'm not anti-Chinese, I should say, by how antagonistic feelings are in much of Asia towards China. And so not only do they have an increasingly problematic U.S. situation, Japan situation, they have ASEAN and India also, which are in their neighborhood very much. And this is a country that has lost $1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, that has 300% debt to GDP ratios, that has credit growing twice as fast as nominal income, which is what you use to service the debt. And so I see tremendous problems for China ahead, because of and the pollution and the 20 or 30 million extra males that can't get married. You put that together, and I see what you said squared. And I'm just wondering if you are as pessimistic as I'm feeling, not thinking.
Okay, directly or
Yeah, directly.
okay. So actually, the first point is: should Asian neighbors actually, feel threatened as much as the US, or maybe even more?
More.
And more, and absolutely more. And Vietnam, of course, they are the ones who now have to compete directly with China and under very unequal conditions. So Vietnam is really in a tight spot. Think about Korea. In particular in these high-tech industries and IT, Korea is actually, so for instance, one concrete example. China, over the last 2 years, is pushing like mad to move forward in what's called memory semiconductors. And at the beginning it doesn't make sense, because memory semiconductors used to be the bleeding edge of the industry. You pay, because the cost of establishing these facilities is outrageous. But fortunately enough, there's technological change, and so there are now types of memory semiconductors which have a huge market. And what I'm trying to get at is, one Korean company, Samsung, was dominating that. And China actually, its push, threatens Samsung. But Taiwan is happy, because Taiwan was trying to catch up with Samsung, couldn't do it, and now they're happy that the Chinese actually, pay all this money, and whether or not they succeed, at least they create for a certain period of time excess capacity. But I think it's important for our debate here that we understand we're not the only one who have to deal with China. The Vietnams, the Koreas, the Myanmars, from a different level, they all have to deal with that. can we maybe at some stages build coalitions? Okay. The second question was, am I optimistic or pessimistic?
Yeah.
Who is here from China? Who is here from China? Okay. So these people obviously are much closer, to. I'm just an outsider, and I go there, let's say, 10 times per year, and probably you too. And what I learned from the old China hands is, because it's a continent, so many different realities. China will move forward in the end. China will move forward. So we are based here. We try to understand the changing structure of this international economic system. I think in the end, maybe a tremendous cost for different populations in China and outside, but China will move forward. Maybe this is the shortest answer I can give.
Okay. So I guess I find it interesting that you talk a lot about them pushing for the Chinese government trying to push forward the semiconductor industry and try to actually turn it into more of an innovative industry. And I guess both with Vietnam, Myanmar, and those types of countries, as well as China, what do you think the effects of these issues that Manuel talked about of automation replacing jobs actually affecting these countries where the large portion of jobs are industry related or are manufacturing related? We see in China, a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, which is one of the largest employers in China, is planning to automate all of their workers by 2050, I think it was, and 30% of the workforce by 2020. So what type of social unrest will that cause? What type of effects will it have within China, within Vietnam, Myanmar, and on the world at large?
That raises a can of worms. We were invited, to study, to do a background study for this Chinese program or plan, Manufacturing in China 2025. And the most important and actually scaring result of our research was that they had not done any serious research on what are going to be the employment effects, what are going to be the skill effects. And the simple reason is, the drivers behind this program was the Academy of Engineering. And these are people, who are competing for very substantial funds from the government, but also from the renminbi private equity funds. Labor was never an issue until now, but now it's going to be an issue, and a massive one. So you put your finger right on the spot. So far, unemployment, is not a major issue, and the demographics have enabled to continue that, but it will change. So what I'm trying to say is, sophisticated planning on a technocratic or engineering level, but very, very even fundamental, data are missing. What are going to be the employment effects and the skill requirements? Really scary.
Would you like to comment on that?
I've looked at the best data I can find on total factor productivity. And that's the productivity of capital and labor combined, 1 unit of capital and labor. And it used to be 5-6% a year for China, which is extremely high, very, very high. Lately, it's been negative. According to Harry Wu, who is one of the better Hitsusubachi University researchers. And he's been very, very careful. He's not anti-China. He's not trying to do a hatchet job. So if you're starting with a falling workforce and negative factor productivity and a lot of wasted investment and a lot of cleanup of pollution, I don't see, I think they need the productivity growth, is what I'm saying. And so I'm less concerned about the unemployment than I am about the macro. And the other thing, and I just alluded to this in my talk, is that I think there was a survey of Chinese business people with millions of dollars of assets. And I think something like, and this is from memory, 80% wanted to leave the country.
Okay, productivity. So the headline figures for this MIC plan is they want to have 7.5% annual growth of labor productivity until 2020, and from then on, annual 6.5% productivity growth. And as you mentioned, I mean, Wu's figures are substantially lower. It would require a very, very fundamental change. The only positive factor is, and that's something maybe a little bit underestimated. The BATS companies, the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, they are developing at least new business models. They're not copying, they're doing something differently. And apparently, because they can tap into the international capital markets, and they have the ear of the leadership. Mm-hmm. So they have access to real sources so far. Maybe that can make a difference, at least, at the margin. So I agree with your focus on the productivity increase. I mean, if that doesn't work, what else? Yeah. And then the other things, I'm probably not enough qualified to answer that question.
And I guess the what else question is what is very important. It's this idea of, we see in the most developed countries that have almost already gone through this phase of industrialization, they've now hit the point where automation is the next economic enemy or whatever it may be. But so with these countries, are they just, the thought that always comes to my mind is if the U.S. and Europe, actually, you were saying Europe is less so with the automation of jobs, but with the U.S. and Europe already feeling the constraints of this type of economy, what chance do a lot of these nations have that are solely based on industrialized industries like this? And again, I think it's really important to see, a lot of us being from the Western world, what effects will that have on the world at large? So say a falling China, what effect might that have on Europe or on the U.S. And how might the U.S. or Europe react to that sort of thing?
What worries me, and I think we've Daniel and I, we've talked about this in class, is what we're seeing in some of these places is what is being termed premature deindustrialization, which is they're shedding industrial jobs at much lower levels of income per capita than what happened in Europe, Japan, and the United States. So China is now automating jobs at much lower levels of income per capita. So the advantage that low labor costs brought to these places is sort of eroding away because of the effects of of technology. And they're automating jobs through the production of robots and others domestically. So they're even doing it with their own companies that are producing robots and others. So that really puts a question mark over the natural development path that we followed in other places, which is you move people from the countryside and agriculture to industry, they save, they educate their kids, then they move to services and others. And if you don't have that path anymore, we just don't know how to take the son of a farmer in China and make an engineer of the Internet of Things out of him in a generation. We just don't know. We've never done this before. So there's a real issue there about the development path that these countries are going to follow. It also, by the way, and this was mentioned by David before, it really sort of questions the economic policy of the Trump administration, at least the desire to bring back industrial jobs. If we're seeing automation of industrial jobs in China, where labor costs are, 10 times less or on average, or even more, how are the economics going to work for bringing industrial jobs here? Also, another piece of data that we haven't mentioned is industrial output in the U.S. has been going up for the last 20 years. What has not gone up is industrial employment. Those jobs are gone and they're not coming back, and that's what David was saying. So if I was looking at this from the development, sort of economic development perspective of China and other places, my concern would be to keep the development engine going if you take out the industrial piece. Plus, and just to worry people a little bit more, I would also be concerned that at the same time, tech that is being developed in other places and in China, etc., is automating services jobs. So they face the challenge that we face regarding services jobs, and I don't know how many of you have seen the studies, but there are studies out there that about 50% of current jobs are going to be automated in the next 20 years. Most of those jobs are in the services sector: transportation, translation, travel agencies, etc., etc., etc. Journalism, all of these things. They mentioned truck driving, transportation. About 3 million jobs are going to disappear in the next 10 to 15 years in the United States alone, just in transportation, right? So the Chinese have they have a huge challenge because the cost of automation have fallen so much that it now makes sense to eliminate industrial jobs in China. B, by the time they're done with industrialization, they're going to find a services sector where the incentives to automate are also going to be much higher than they are today. So the development path looks really uncertain. So I think they face huge challenges I wouldn't like to be in their situation, But we also face a lot of challenges. I think the Chinese also have from the point of view of institutions and government, they're probably better placed to take some of the measures that I mentioned before, including capital tax and redistributive measures and others. So there's a nuanced debate there about how their institutions might deal with this. But their economic model, and not just China, if you look at the Philippines, Indonesia, all of these countries, how are they going to develop? We just don't know. We just don't know. It's early stages in the debate, but we're seeing a lot of jobs disappearing.
So I'd be interested with, you say you go to China about 10 times a year, which hopefully is enough to get a good answer to this question. Manuel talked before about this sense of tension and fear within at least the European intellectuals who are discussing these issues. Do you sense a similar thing in China? Are they scared of what's to come, or are they more, they think the government will be able to fix it?
So, even friends and colleagues who 5 years ago would have probably, in the end, grudgingly admitted the government may be able to fix it, now would not say that anymore. They would say that since, the new leadership she took over, thinks the skepticism has substantially increased. And why? Because there was hope that at least gradually there would be a reform of the governance of institutions. And that, at least until the fall of this year, till the major meetings will take place, has been put on hold. And that is, of course, not the right environment that you would need in order to address some of these issues. I mentioned that before. There is the Ministry of Employment, and it has a long title, is in the hierarchy. The longer the title of the ministry, the lower its power. And that ministry has really, really low power. And what you would need is, information about on the questions that you raised. What is going to happen? We will have, first of all, we will have increasing academic unemployment. It's already showing quite dramatically. But much more important, what's going to happen with the people who will now stay in the second, third, lower tier cities and in the countryside. What kind of jobs? Where will they create the market, which is supposed to drive the system? Because the system cannot anymore increase its exports. So it needs to increase its sales domestically. Mm-hmm. So, on a very high level of intellectuals at the leading universities, you have this debate. Does it filter through to the policy, not debates, but the working groups? Not really, because still basically engineers are driving this. From our perspective, it would be nice if we would have more engineers shaping our industrial and trade policies. But from their perspective, it's unfortunately balanced to the other extreme.
So I guess now we'd actually like to open up to audience questions. We have 2 microphones here and here. And if you have a question, if you can get up and you could line up behind whichever microphone is closest to you, and we'll go back and forth
And
between.
introduce themselves.
Oh yeah, introduce yourself as well. Thank you. And so as everyone's getting situated, I think we'll start over here on my right.
Yep. Hi, my name is Dennis Braunitz, and I am a third-year student here at Tufts University. Is this working? Yep. Okay. So, once again, thank you so much for your time here. Thank you to the panelists, Daniel, the moderator, and of course, the Institute for Global Leadership. So basically, we have covered the ideas of having, these revised welfare systems and the potential for having universal basic income, both being ways of safeguarding the prosperity of the so-called working class, the class that will not capitalize on the current and upcoming innovation. So my question will hope to bring out some potential solutions to how we can safeguard the sustainable development in both developed and developing nations. So there are arguments that revolve around the need to increase regulation over the companies that are really breaking ground in artificial intelligence in the world of automation. And it is safe to assume that these firms will gravitate to countries with an inclusive and healthy environment for their activities. So basically, ecosystems that are not overly regulated. So my question is the following. How will governments strike a balance and even what we could call a social contract with these disruptive companies, which threaten and are changing the nature of the labor market? Will we need a new multilateral framework that will establish the rules of the game for disruptive innovation on a global level, leveling out the playing field across the world? Thank you.
And if we can keep responses to just a couple minutes, because we want to make sure we get through a bunch of questions. So whoever would like to respond first can go.
Okay. Yes, we need that. The experience, however, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was an attempt to develop code of conduct on technology transfer. Very different world, very different technologies, but basically the idea was to create international governance systems that would allow to reduce technological inequality. It fizzled out. Because the first thing, of course, was it cannot be legally binding, these code of conducts. It's a question of my age, but I was, participating in some of these debates, so I could see when Nestle, for instance, came in and said, look, it's all fine and good, we want that, but we cannot, constrain ourselves. Okay, the methodology of the high-tech industry, they would say regulations kill innovation, which I completely disagree, but it's a very powerful argument. I mean, in terms of the capacity to prevent policies. Another area, and then I stop, it would be, there is a debate, at least we should or implement policies of minimum income. This is a completely minority position, unfortunately. It makes economically a lot of sense. It could be done. The only one who is right now arguing for it is the poor guy who is the socialist candidate in France, who has who has no chance whatsoever elected.
Getting elected, yes.
Huh?
Very difficult.
Yeah.
You might get to the second round, though, in France.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever. No. So, look, I mean, the short answer is yes, we would need that. We have that for the financial sector. We have that, we actually need that for patents. We need that for standards. We need in many, many areas that impinge on these issues. It's not just directly, how to regulate firms that are actively investing in AI, for instance. It's so important, to talk about what's called standard essential patents. Patents that you need if you want to develop a particular, I mean, you need to license a patent if you want to develop a particular technology. The companies that control standard essential patents is a very small group of companies. So, I mean, it's multifaceted. Maybe I ask you back, I mean, where would you start?
So definitely it will be hard to come up with a thorough answer here on the spot, but one of the big issues here is how do you prevent or get countries to cooperate, right? And
On what?
on these standard patterns, right? And these frameworks that make it possible to have regulation on a global level. Just because, and as you've seen, you have so many countries, I mean, like Luxembourg and Ireland, where these are kind of the areas where companies move and, you know, they incorporate their headquarters there because there are tax incentives. And I mean, even within the EU, that's causing a lot of troubles on a political level as well, not just the economic. So once again, I do not have an answer to that. What I would think is that the government is in need of innovation. For us young people right now, I don't really see too much of an incentive. I mean, I'm from the Czech Republic and part of the European Union, and I do not see a light at the end of the tunnel of me having a career working in public service in that country. I want to be on the edge of innovation. So if governments can create incentives for people like us to be there and work hand in hand with those who are innovating and work together, then yes, perhaps that could be the answer to it. But at this point in time, with the rise of populism and the rhetoric and things like that, there is no clear incentive. But once again, I'm trying to understand whether this can be done on a multilateral framework, multilateral level, which I honestly do not think, because these companies will then move somewhere else. They can move from China to Taiwan, they can move to Japan, to Korea.
But before we get actually into discussion, because we're probably going to save that for afterwards.
One last thing. So
Good try, Daniel.
One last thing. It's always good to start with simple things, yeah? So taxation is obviously one area which would have tremendous impact. So what I'm saying is, you need to disaggregate this. I mentioned standards and, the governance of patenting. Not just the protection, but the development and use of patents, licensing markets. I mean, the licensing markets shape the scope for innovation. Huge business. And no one talks about that. So governance, zero. We need it. But it's interesting that it comes from someone who, explained that you would like to go into innovative companies and you're searching for rational policies after all. Well, maybe one day we'll have it. What do you think?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So I would divide it in two things, because I think one thing is regulation, the other one is taxation, and they're connected, but they're not the same thing. So in terms of regulation, I think what the digital marketplace produces is a very similar dynamic to what we've seen in other cases of interdependence. So I mean, the digital market is completely global, right? These companies operate globally. They have impact around the world with what they do, but they're regulated nationally and in some instances subnationally. So this is a very suboptimal system. So imagine if you're Uber, Airbnb, Facebook. Normally, I mean, these companies have a lot of pressure, regulatory pressure in the places where they're based, so in California, in the United States, etc., but they operate worldwide. So you have the regulator that is regulating them is not getting all the inputs that it probably should. So you have the people doing the displacing and then the displaced, but the displaced are normally in different constituencies. So what this is producing is a classic case of interdependence and of pressure to elevate the regulation to a higher level, right? So for example, those of us that have studied European integration, I could put you to bed easily, all of you, if I told you how the process, because it's somewhat elaborate, but in essence, the reason why European countries have elevated the regulation on a whole range of issues to the European level is because they were extremely interdependent, and it made a lot of sense to have common quality standards, common labor laws, et cetera, right? So I think what the digital market is producing is a lot of pressure to harmonize at a higher level. If not, I think the externalities are going to be very big. Countries are going to exit the system. They're going to block companies from operating within their borders, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how that process is going to play out is very unclear. But what is clear is the pressure, And the optimal set of arrangements is going to be to elevate this European level, maybe transatlantically. If we ever had a TTIP, maybe we could have a chapter on this and have a council of some sort that regulates some of these issues. So I think that that's there. On the taxing is even more interesting and complicated, because this is going to be a very aggressive world and very competitive world. The countries that have the companies that are competitive in this market, and this is a winner-takes-all market, are going to have fiscal traction over those companies. So if you have the Microsofts, the Googles, etc., and you can tax them, and they're not going to leave your jurisdiction because they need to operate within it because you're a huge market, then you're going to have tax revenue. If not, you're going to be out of the game, right? And so there's the question is that, okay, if we agree that you need to tax capital, how do you do it in a way that borders are not so significant, right? How do you get tax revenue from capital in a way that can be global? And one of the solutions, and this has been put out there, is you establish large public venture capital funds, so sovereign wealth funds that invest in technology and innovation. That means you simply operate across borders. Saudi Arabia actually just announced that they're creating 100 billion venture capital, and they're going to invest across the board. So they could buy Google shares, they can buy Apple shares, and then they get the dividends from those companies. So that's one solution. Someone was putting out actually, Janusz Varoufakis, is the former finance minister of Greece, with whom I disagree on 99% of the things he says, but in this issue he had an interesting suggestion, which was whenever you have an IPO of a tech company, you could have a small percentage of the IPO go to a public wealth fund, right, a sovereign wealth fund. So that over time essentially is like a tax on capital, but you will need IPOs. Not all companies IPO. This would be dependent on which companies IPO in your stock markets, et cetera, et cetera. So I think on the taxation side, we're going to move to a world where countries start establishing large public venture capital funds, and they invest or co-invest with private funds of some kind, and they invest across the world. So it's curious, but you're moving to a world where taxation is also going to be, revenue from this is going to be global. I don't see another way around this, but these are separate issues. I think the regulation and the taxation. I don't know if that was too long. Sorry.
No, it's great. We'll move on to the next question.
Thank you.
And we'll try to get a couple more in. And so we'll go over here to my left. And introduce yourself first, please.
Good evening. My name is Nicolae Dorlea, and I'm actually a senior from Connecticut College. So I spent 8 months in China, kind of on a Fulbright scholarship, and I really tried to, kind of get an understanding of the society. Obviously, limited time, but I tried to extend my stay for as long as I could. And one of the things that I noticed was that there was tremendous inequality in terms of the access to the amount of money coming into China. The money's flooding these special economic zones, often centered around the East Coast or the big cities, and the cities, of course, are thriving and filled with foreigners. It's almost like a New York. If you go to Xi'an, one of the oldest traditional cities in China, now it seems like a New York City. Yet the money's not getting dispersed around the surrounding suburbs. So you have, obviously tremendous inequality in access to healthcare in China's suburbs and kind of countries and rural areas, which is a problem that I'm personally trying to solve now through kind of a nonprofit. But my question is, regardless of kind of the obvious social problems created by an economy, by a government policy only focused on economic expansion, China is still able to lay down infrastructure so efficiently. They're able to take a train from Xi'an to Beijing, say Chicago to New York, in 6 to 8 hours for under $100. A train ride that in the United States now costs about $300 and it's going to take you 24 to maybe 30 hours to get there. So my question is, I guess two-parted. One, if the United States government aligns with private corporations to lay down such an infrastructure or force companies such as Uber to become public enterprises so that everybody has access to transportation, will that not make the nation more efficient, and will that not create many, many more jobs? And secondly, are we seeing, kind of ideologically speaking, are we seeing the slowdown of capitalism and our capitalist and kind of individually focused, kind of the tendency of America to be focused on the individual? Are we ideologically hesitating to go to a kind of more socialist economy where we integrate the society more cohesively? And why is this happening? Because if you look at China's economic kind of development model, it's, crossing the river while feeling for the stones, which basically translates into like, you're going to develop in a very loose manner. You're not going to have an actual idea of how to get to where you want to go. You have a rough idea, and then you just kind of like feel your way around. So I guess that's kind of my question. Thank you.
Let me do. I think there's no doubt that capitalist countries are slowing down. Whether or not capitalism is slowing down is a different question. The reason we have rotten trains is because we fly and drive, and we made that choice with a subsidized highway system, but a taxed railway system, basically. And you can argue whether or not that was a good decision, but that was the decision we made, and it's highly unlikely that except for very few corridors which you can identify that we would go in the direction of high-speed rail. My understanding is that outside of Shanghai, Beijing, and a few other routes, most of those routes you're referring to are actually losing money. But having said that, China does a super job of building high-speed rail. I mean, it's the most efficient, constructor, and they've created an incredible web, and it is knitting the country together. So I think historians will debate whether or not it was a good overall investment or not. That's not something we know. I don't think that if you look at our healthcare system, it is more socialized than Canada's. The federal government through Medicare, Medicaid, veterans, and so on, spends much, much more per capita than Canada does in total, just from the federal government. So I don't think the problem is a lack of socialism. I think it's a lack of balance in the allocation of benefits. And with respect to that other question with regulation and so on, I think it's, if we thought experiment, we suddenly have an explosion in productivity, we can all work 1 day a week and get a $50,000 minimum income, okay? If we could do that, then we would want all that productivity. Who would not want to work only 1 day a week and get a reasonable income and work more and get more, maybe? The problem is that the institutions are not running sometimes as fast as the productivity, and as a result, there's a mismatch, and I think that's where we are right now. Our institutions, political, social, otherwise, even value, are trying to catch up with what's happening. And that's going to be a messy period, and it could be a violent period, but we'll probably sort it out over the next several generations, but that isn't much comfort.
One of the few really important and brave things which was done during the Obama administration was what's called the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Program. Who knows about this program? The Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Program. So with almost no money, very little money, provided by Congress, they were able to establish, I think by now, these are 11 such advanced manufacturing partnership industrial innovation institutes. And they have very interesting structure. I mean, it's public-private partnership. It's in particular region with regard to, historically grown specialization for particular industries. So, for instance, Ohio has this Manufacturing Innovation Institute for 3D printing, and it's basically bringing together the elite universities and the community colleges, big players from the industry and small players. These institutes still exist. No one knows what's going to happen. It was basically after, some people in the Obama administration were putting the catalyst forward. It was basically pushed forward by the states. It's one way to go, yes. In the end, your remarks about inequality in China, absolutely. I mean, there are statistics about the increasing inequality in China that are really staggering.
I have a couple of comments. So on the capitalism piece, I think that the trends that we were discussing they're simply unsustainable. So even if you consider yourself a supporter of capitalism or liberal market economics, etc. I mean, I consider myself a liberal in the classical sense. I think you have to agree that some adjustments have to take place if we want the system to be sustainable politically, right? So some of the measures that we have been suggesting, or I have been suggesting at least, some people are very critical of them, and they say, well, that's very interventionist. You're defending part of the populist agenda. That's precisely what parties like Podemos and others are defending, like universal basic income and others, right? The difference, of course, is that many of these populist parties are actually anti-capitalist, so they have very strong anti-capitalist movements within them. My thesis is we need to introduce economic sustainability, social and political sustainability into the system, and we want to keep some of the fundamental elements of the capitalist system in place, right? If you ask the Brit, for example, in the early 1900s in London, and you said to him, or her, do you think in 30, 40 years the state should be levying an income tax and paying for public education and public health care? He would have said, well, you're crazy. That's the agenda of the Bolsheviks, that's the communist agenda. That's precisely what we ended up agreeing after the convulsion, right? After communism, fascism, 2 world wars. That is the new equilibrium we found after the convulsion. So I think that we need to be imaginative and find solutions from a belief in free market, free trade, innovation, etc., but introduce sustainability into the system. On the productivity dependency point that David just mentioned before, I find this quite fascinating. So if you look at the history of human societies, we for many centuries we had very little dependency because our productivity really did not allow for dependency, right? We basically all had to work for survival, etc. So if you think of our history and our social institutions, even the welfare state is the institutionalization of dependency, because what did we do through the welfare state? We had people studying, people retired, people in sick leave, etc., weekends. I mean, all of these institutions are in essence the ossification of dependency, right? When we speak of universal basic incomes and others, what we're saying in essence is extending dependency. Why is this affordable? Precisely because we've continued to gain in productivity. Now, the big question is, yes, if productivity allows us to sustain that dependency, will our institutions be flexible enough and quick enough to change in order to adjust and make those changes? And that's a fascinating question about the rigidity of our institutions. Because even if the productivity allows it, and don't forget this, I forgot to say it in my talk, we are failing at the management of prosperity. I mean, this is an issue of the rigidity of our institutions. We've never been more prosperous than today. And yet we have issues of inequality, issues of stagnation in the middle, and a huge political upheaval. Donald Trump was elected president of this country on an agenda to change the system, literally break the system and change it entirely, in a country that had never been as prosperous as it was when he was elected. The U.S. returned to pre-crisis GDP levels in 2012, right? So this is fascinating stuff. I mean, we're failing at the governance of all of this prosperity. We're failing at at managing that explosion of productivity. So my thesis and that of many people is we need to increase the dependency through institutions and through the expansion of the welfare state. And that will provide the system with political sustainability. Whether we do it or not I think it's going to be dependent on the flexibility of the system or its rigidity. Rigid systems, by the way, require huge amounts of tension and pain to accumulate at different points of the system before they change. If the system is too rigid, what we're going to get is that tension accumulating without the system changing until it snaps. And that's what happens. I mean, do we need Marine Le Pen to win in France? Do we need, Trump to win a second mandate and someone worse than Trump coming and winning? Sorry, I'm being politically biased, but someone even more populist coming and winning another election in the U.S. to change some of our institutions? That's a question, that will be answered by the flexibility of the system.
So we have a little bit of time. We'll go over to the question over here. All right, well, you just got up. We'll go back to this side then. Lay your question really quick.
Oh, I'm actually an engineer, computer engineer. Are there any engineers in this room? That's good. I'm a computer engineer for more than 35 years, starting from the time when everything was vertically integrated. It was all in the U.S., not all. We were starting to push some manufacturing out. When I start looking at some of these models, like when, Dr. Dieter, when you talk about the semiconductor industry really can't be looked at as an independent entity. It's sort of, has anybody really started looking at the linked supply chain from everything from the sand to the finished computer? Because as we migrated things across the ocean over the years, there are all sorts of things, interdependencies that affected that migration. And I think to understand where things are going in the future, you really have to create that linkage in your model, because we're starting to look at trying to bring things back because the labor content is going down as automation starts to proliferate, and so we don't have to worry about the high labor rates in the US anymore. But bringing those things back is limited by the fact that we've built this whole supply chain over in China, so there's all those implications of trying to bring it back. And so when you say that China is a customer of semiconductors, it's really hard to untangle that, because at the corporate level, it may be reported, as an American company, but that American company may be making their semiconductor somewhere overseas that then gets put in, a computer board that's made over in China that then gets sold back to the US. The same thing in the auto industry, where you've got this whole supply chain, things are going back and forth, and your company is actually split across the world. Is anybody building such a model? Or starting to look at it that way?
So, I'm not sure whether I understand what is your question. I mean,
So it's like when we talk about the semiconductor industry,
yeah.
and when so some of the quotes that you made of U.S. is selling semiconductors to the thing. It's like that. It's hard to put any meaning to that, because is that a U.S. corporation that actually designed it?
No, I get it.
Manufactured it, moved it to China, sold it to a Fox?
No, it's a corporate perspective. So for Intel, for Qualcomm, they need the Chinese market. So, I mean, the only way to understand anything of this industry is by looking at it at supply and demand chains. And you need to go, all the way. I wouldn't start with the sand, but at least for silicon-based semiconductors, you could do that. But you also have compound semiconductors, so you might start somewhere else. But you need, absolutely, you need to have a system approach in order to understand where are actually the positions of power. Who actually shapes, who has the capacity to extract the most value in this whole value chain. Not only we, I mean, this is, people who research this industry are doing that.
Right, but so Intel as a company, so over the last few decades, we as a high-tech industry have tended to fund initiatives that were high in intellectual property content.
Yeah.
In other words, if you go to a venture capitalist, you're not going, and you say, oh, I want to build something made out of hardware. They won't give you the time of day.
Yeah.
All right? Now things are migrating towards hardware. So the things that are capital intensive are actually getting funded outside the US. And those may be separate corporations, but they also may be parts of Intel. So for example, Intel may own the intellectual property for a processor chip, and they may report it as a sale to China, but that processor chip may not be manufactured in the US. It may be manufactured at a fab in a fabrication facility in the Far East and shipped physically from one part of the Far East to the next.
Before we get to the back and forth, because it's a very important conversation, but we do have a few more questions and we only have a few more minutes. If we can save the rest of this conversation until afterward, it would be great, so we can just make sure we get.
Bilateral, yeah?
Yeah.
So, but he raises an important point. I think I understand it now, which complicates policymaking.
Right.
Which complicates, even more so international governance approaches. Much more difficult. The former R&D head of IBM, I forgot his name right now. Then we do it bilaterally. Afterwards.
Well, we'll save the rest of it for later. We
Just can I make one statement? So the
we only have to keep moving. We only have 10 more minutes.
Two words. The money doesn't flow in the same direction that the product does.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes it really complicated.
Yes, of course.
Okay, and we'll go quickly over here to your question, and we'll save you two will be the last two questions unless anyone else gets in line really quick. And if we make them quick, that'll be great.
Hello, yes, I'm Michael. I'm a cadet from the United States Military Academy. And so my question is based around, obviously, within Syria and the Middle East and just around the world in general, we're having multiple conflicts and multiple different situations that are causing a huge immigration crisis that we see in Europe as of right now. And so my question is more directed to Dr. Manuel, because you spoke about it more deeply, but the state funded, or like the welfare state that you prescribe, such as the universal income and the different types of healthcare, as the different immigrants from Syria and different areas of the world begin to move into Europe, some leaving, but some also staying, do you believe that these countries will be able to sustain this type of system for much longer, or for long?
Oh, do you want me to take it? Just to comment on the question about Intel, that I'll get back to Syria real quick. International trade is extremely complex, right? So if you start introducing tariff barriers and breaking up trade agreements, what you're doing is you're really disturbing and you're modifying all of those tiny micro decisions that were taken in a market with a lot of intelligence and a lot of actors in them, so you tend to destroy a lot of value. So that's why in international trade we're very skeptical about doing these things, and we think that actually open trade and trade agreements are very good because you leave some of those minute decisions in the hands of the actors that have a lot more information. So I guess if we start disrupting those chains, we're going to destroy a lot of value in the process. But on Syria, I don't know. They're going to have a very hard time because you need capable states. You need states that can have fiscal traction over these things. You need states that have sophisticated economies with companies in the innovation sector. You need to have the capacity to disperse the income. I just don't know. I mean, Syria is almost a failed state, in many areas of the country at the very least. I mean, you have no governance whatsoever. So I think for them now the main worry is to have peace and stability. I don't think they're that concerned about these issues. So I don't have a very good answer because I think their problems at this time are not so much linked to these issues, but just pure stability and peace. I think that's the first issue.
Were you speaking about Syria or about Europe?
More of the immigrants' effect on Europe.
Yeah.
Oh, the effect of immigrants in Europe, but as it relates to this policy of basic income and others. So I'm of the opinion. So a lot of people think that the big driver of what we're seeing in Europe politically is this issue of immigration and identity and issue. And I think that actually the numbers in Europe are not that large. I mean, if you look at the percentages of these immigrants in Germany, even Germany, Sweden, France, some of the countries that are taking in, particularly the Germans and the Swedes, more people are not very, very large. So I think if we had these policies and people did not have the sense of the erosion of the middle class, the death of economic opportunity, sort of intergenerational opportunity, I think the reaction towards immigration would be much less aggressive or radical. I mean, definitely not as significant as we have seen. So I think this policy could help on the immigration debate because it would make it less disruptive for politics in Europe. In the U.S., for example, you've seen you're losing immigrants to Mexico. This has been happening for a few years now, and yet this became a central theme of the campaign. And so the question emerges: why now? Even in places where you don't have high immigration or you have or you're actually losing migrants to other countries, this emerges. So there are hints in there that tell me that this is not so much about the immigration, but about the economics. So I think if we solve the economics, then I think the immigration and integration piece will be much simpler.
Could I just add to that? Most of these societies you're referring to have negative population growth, or very nearly. Total fertility rates around 1.5 or something like that, when you need 2.1 to replace the population. So, I mean, over time, you need a fairly large migrant stream to stabilize population and workforce. Now, that doesn't mean you want to, but I'm just saying, you know, stabilizing is different from growing rapidly. And so keeping those things analytically distinct is helpful.
Great. We're going to go over these last two questions over here.
Great, thank you for your presentations. I'm Sophia Lacour, I'm from Trinity College Dublin, and I have a question regarding, it's a bit different than which has been asked before. So our world is becoming older and we don't want like many kids anymore today. We focus more on our careers, and technological power is increasing. So what effect does have economy to teach and educate the older generation? Because like our generations, we grow up in the globalization and the new use of technology. So yeah, my question is, which effect does like this technology and teaching and education have on the economy?
One point on the demography and the aging is that people tend to be very worried about the aging of societies, and they are very pessimistic about this. I think the key is, again, productivity, because if we increase productivity, we can sustain a greater dependency. So I think the issue about aging and whether that's sustainable or not is really a question about productivity. If we have productivity gains, we can probably sustain a much greater dependency. So on the teaching and the tech, so we know, for example, I think the latest figures from the European Commission are that there are about 2 million jobs in the EU right now that cannot be filled because companies cannot find the people with the right skills. So at the same time as we're having this sort of employment and precariousness crisis, we're really failing at the training of people. So, irrespective of your projections about automation, we're clearly failing at the transition. We could be doing a much better job at training people for the right jobs in Europe. At least in Europe, but I guess the situation is similar in the United States. And the studies that we have is, they show very clear trends. So there are basically two vectors of skills that are in much higher demand now than they were some years ago, and that is quantitative skills, mathematics, programming, etc., and social skills. So anything that has to do with managing people, managing groups, negotiation, mediation, all of those things. If the job category falls in between those two, so has elements of those two, they have seen big growth in the last few years. And then, of course, the jobs that don't fall within that category, those categories, then we've seen declines. Anything that is routine, repetitive, not creative, doesn't involve engaging with others, etc. Those are the ones that have been automated. So we have already an idea of where the jobs are and where the skill demand is. But now, if your prediction is we're going to get a huge AI development and boost, and that's going to automate all sorts of jobs in services, and you're very radical about your predictions, then you're really questioning the future of jobs in general, and then education becomes almost irrelevant. But that's a bit controversial to say in a university and as an academic, because that means that you're going to have very few jobs of people, programmers and some entrepreneurs that are going to transfer this technology to the market, and then the rest of the people, a large proportion of the people, are going to be almost fully dependent on those on those companies and the revenue that they produce. Now, that's very radical. I think that in the medium term we should really focus on training on those skills and make sure that we don't fail at filling 2 million jobs at a time of huge unemployment and precariousness. That there are companies that are struggling to fill 2 million jobs. That's clearly a failure of our education and how we're training people.
I'd like to quickly comment because I'm on a different aspect of what you're talking about. For summer work, I teach old people how to use technology. They don't know what they're doing for the most part, and so that's going to be another an actual huge problem. Is that as either a huge problem or a huge opportunity, depending on how you look at it. Opportunity for people like me who are able to go and help teach them, but they will become, as the older population grows, and technology increases in tandem, it's going to become more and more complicated just for them to navigate the world itself.
Unless the robots help them.
That's the hope. I think we'll quickly take your dog back there, and then we'll get the one more over here, and those will be our last two questions.
Hi, so I'm Thal, as Daniel mentioned. I'm part of the EPIIC colloquium this year. I have two questions. My first question is relevant to my country. So we have a whole slave industry based on fishing that, I mean, every product you buy here based on the fishing industry, prawns and stuff, they're all fueled by slave labor in Myanmar. So how do you see the economy of tomorrow affecting these most vulnerable people in our society? My second question is related to conflict. So you've mentioned so many things that are affecting the world: populism, the rise of inequality, and all these things are fueling conflicts like nationally. But do you expect to see something like a World War III in the future because of these increasing nationalisms, increasing divides within societies? Because as you mentioned, in the 20th century, you saw this whole shift of totalitarian and stuff like that, and that's part of what caused the conflicts that happened during that time. So, yeah.
So if we can get quick responses from everyone.
On slave labor, I think what happened with sneakers and Nike and so on is probably the model to look to, where some combination of social media pressure, information about what the actual situation was, fed through into corporate governance, or in your case of fishing, it would be governance of the buyers, getting back through the supply chain. And I think that offers a realistic chance of curbing, not eliminating, what you're talking about. For World War III, I'll pass to my more knowledgeable colleagues.
Would you like to take it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if political radicalization continues, and we're seeing trends that we saw in the 20th century with nationalism, the rising of borders again, of building of walls, the aggression against minorities, all of these things, I think there's a very thin line between nationalism and conflict, because, you're essentially exalting some, characteristics and some groups over others. And, for example, the aggression against minorities, we saw this in the 20th century, and it was small minorities, and then it was larger minorities, and then everybody was a minority, And, I think we have very poor memory about these things, but what we've been seeing with some of the communities in Europe, and not just, by the way, migrant communities, but Jewish communities, the Muslim community in various places, and now here is a much bigger community, which is, I'm not sure what that community is now. I mean, except maybe this is one of the problems with populists, right? It's sort of the people against the others, but the others it's an amorphous category, so it keeps on growing, and they mobilize it and they tweak it and they use it politically. So I think that's a very dangerous path to go down. On the geopolitical front, by the way, there's this piece on China that I think is fascinating, which is called I don't know if you've heard about this, but they're calling it the reverse Nixon, and it's this idea that the big geopolitical piece of the Obama administration is actually the containment of China, and most of the policies that we've seen, both the Taiwan issue, the trade war, the appointment of Tillerson, the opening of Russia, that's why it's called the reverse Nixon. Instead of opening China to contain Central Asia and Russia, what you're seeing is the opening of Russia to contain China, issues in the Middle East, geopolitics in the Middle East, with Russia to control the Middle East and energy supply to China. So there's this whole thesis that actually what we're seeing is a return of realpolitik, which is again very 20th century, the containment and balance of power. And in the world today, that big piece means containing China. And that, the experience is not very good. It's very difficult. Whether the Russians will go along is questionable. But, and I'm not sure if there's this logic in the administration, but there's some analysis out there that this is how the whole thing is looking. Again, that's very 20th century, but it's playing out in the Asia Pacific instead of the heart of Europe.
Okay, I think we'll try to get to the last question here really quick.
So I'm a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I'm a law major, so I'm a t-ball player in the major leagues right now. But I have a really simple question in the fact that, so we're talking a lot about emerging technologies lowering labor productivity, and how labor productivity is, and how labor productivity, lowering the labor productivity could in the future lower GDP, and how GDP is kind of like the determinant of prosperity within a country. So my question really is, how do you account for things like Airbnb and Uber, where those aren't really accounted for in GDP or in labor productivity, but yet again, still contribute to the prosperity of a nation?
Let me try to answer that. First of all, labor requirements are lowered. Labor productivity is raised.
Okay.
Okay. Uber is counted in GDP. They have it through a credit card. It goes into GDP just like any other sale would. So it's not invisible. I've talked to cab drivers who have done both, and they say you make about the same amount of money after you allow for the fact that when you're a cab driver on your own, sometimes people stiff you for fares. With Uber, it's not a problem. The company does it. Basically, to the cab driver level, they're making about the same amount of money, but they have more flexibility. From the GDP point of view, there's not a great difference, except that you're saving on capital because you're using cars that are otherwise used for other purposes, and that's not true with cabs. I think it helps, but I think Uber and Airbnb and so on are good because they save on capital, but I don't think it's as transformative at a GDP level as opposed to an industry level as it might appear.
No, just on productivity data, there's some fascinating data about the productivity of U.S. workers in industry. So, for example, in the 1970s, you needed about 25 U.S. workers to produce 1 million of output, and now that figure is about 6 point something.
Yeah.
So huge increases in labor productivity. So we have seen labor productivity. The issue is that, it's the reverse, right? Is that you need less labor to produce what in the past needed a lot more labor. So we're doing away with the need for labor.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yeah, but on the measurement side, not just Uber, but digital, the music. Do you think there's a measurement issue there at all? With the new
there is, definitely. But with music more, because when you bought CDs, that was,
sale
easier than the sort of 2 cents for, the streaming services and so on.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up. It's about 9:07, so we've had a really great panel. It's been a good long panel. But I think everyone, if we can give a round of applause to our panelists here, that'd be great. And just a quick reminder to all of you, we will be continuing our symposium tomorrow at 10:30 with Admiral James Stavridis will be speaking to us on the future of something. Security. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking too. I don't know where.
That's why I mentioned that I was a law major. I completely. So we cleared it up for me.